Greetings. This lecture is on World War II. After World War I, the United States government avoided international commitments which might lead to involvement in another war. Even Japanese, Italian, and German aggression in the 1930s did not alter the commitment to isolationism. In the spring of 1941, the United States had a decoding device known as MAGIC. This was able to read Japanese intelligence. But even with MAGIC, the Americans were unaware that a huge Japanese task force had left the Kuril Islands on November 15th. Its destination was Pearl Harbor. On December 7th, the surprise Japanese attack sank or partially destroyed 8 battleships. Only the day of infamy at Pearl Harbor altered American foreign policy for direct action. America's entrance in the war had dire consequences for many Japanese Americans. The war also resulted in significant changes at home as ordinary Americans played their part in war production. War in Asia dated back to 1931. In 1931, aggressive leaders won control in Japan, which led to the invasion of Manchuria. Japanese plans to build a greater East Asia coast prosperity sphere appeared to others as a thinly veiled call for empire. Any allusion to the contrary disappeared in 1937 with a full-scale Japanese invasion of China. The response of the League of Nations was weak, and war waged on in China. Atrocities such as the bombing of Shanghai, the rape of Nanjing followed. Despite division between Chinese nationalists and Chinese communists, China was able to tie the Japanese down in a prolonged and bloody stalemate. The United States government protested Japanese aggression, but only gave limited support to the Chinese. For one, the United States lacked sufficient military power to challenge Japanese predominance in East Asia. President Franklin D. Roosevelt avoided confrontation. Quote, "I simply have not got enough Navy to go around, and every little episode in the Pacific means fewer ships in the Atlantic." Another consideration was the fact that America carried out significant trade with Japan. American exports to Japan were 3 times as much as what was sent to China. After Germany's invasion of Poland and the beginning of World War II in early September 1939, Japan expanded its invasion of lands in East Asia. When the Japanese invaded and occupied large areas of China, the American government responded by limiting exports to Japan, particularly oil. Since 1911, Japan and the United States had a commercial treaty that linked the two nations. When the Americans terminated the commercial treaty, some feared conflict since Japan depended heavily on the United States for oil and scrap metal. American concerns were warranted. In 1940, the Japanese allied with Germany and Italy and invaded northern Indochina. The Americans had proof that Japan was part of a worldwide totalitarian threat. In the eyes of Japanese leaders, the pact between Germany, Italy, and Japan was, quote, to deter the United States from intervening in either the Atlantic or Pacific. Japan also desired an agreement with the Soviet Union, which was still aligned with Germany due to the earlier Nazi-Soviet pact. In 1941, Japan was still mired in a stalemate with China that left it no closer to victory than it had been 4 years earlier. A tightening American embargo on oil left Japan with a limited window of opportunity for carving off its empire. When the Americans stopped all oil, the Japanese made plans to seize Dutch and British oil fields rather than ending its aggression and forfeiting control in East Asia. The new premier of Japan was General Hideki Tojo, and he and other militant Japanese leaders envisioned bold moves. If the American embargo on strategic materials was not lifted, the Japanese would fight the Americans. The Japanese foreign minister stated that, quote, one cannot obtain a tiger's cub unless he braves the tiger's den. According to historian Paul Johnson, it is a myth that Roosevelt was anxious to bring America into the war. However, the United States did begin to assist the British after their entrance in the war. For example, the Neutrality Act of November 1939 included a cash and carry provision that belligerents could obtain American war supplies. This favored the British, especially through Canadian channels. In March of 1941, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act, which gave the green light to any plan to assist countries whose defense the president deemed vital to the defense of the United States. Circumventing the problem of British debt and notions of strict neutrality, war supplies went to England immediately. Also, the United States had instituted its first peacetime draft, and it had increased defense spending. American naval vessels, although neutral, became more involved in the Atlantic War. But American military preparation was not strong in late November 1941, when 6 carriers, 2 battleships, and other Japanese ships started their journey toward Hawaii. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese crippled the Pacific Fleet with a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Americans were furious. The day after the attack, Roosevelt asked for a declaration of war, and it was granted immediately. Germany and Italy then declared war on the United States. Isolationism was history, and the United States entered World War II suddenly determined and more unified. Through 1942, the war news from Europe and Africa was bad for the Allies, and the Japanese won again and again in the Pacific. But efforts in the United States to prepare for war moved speedily. Government agencies were created to allocate scarce materials, supervise mobilization, mediate labor disputes, and check inflation. The pace of industrial change was amazing. The nation produced more war material than its Axis enemies combined. The Depression was over. Farm income was up, and full employment brought a middle-class standard of living to millions of families that had previously known much more difficult times. The astonishing success of American war production was due to, quote, the essential dynamism and flexibility of the American enterprise system. The American government decided early that the defeat of Germany took priority over the defeat of Japan. But much to the dismay of the Soviet Union, locked in a desperate battle against the Nazis on the Eastern Front, an Allied invasion of Europe was put off in favor of campaigns in Africa and Italy. The United States and Britain, aided immensely by a series of stunning technological achievements in intelligence gathering and enhanced strategic abilities, turned the tide on the Western Front. The final key to victory was the Allied invasion of France on June 6, 1944. Less than a year after the D-Day invasion, Hitler was dead and the war in Europe was over. After Pearl Harbor, the Americans began a two-pronged drive to defeat Japan. The army under General Douglas MacArthur began to drive through New Guinea to the Philippines. At the same time, the Navy under Admiral Chester Nimitz attacked westward from Pearl Harbor, and basically the Americans were island hopping to the Philippines, defeating the Japanese at one island and then moving to the next, and the whole process repeating itself. After the victory at Midway in June 1942, American forces moved into Japanese-held territories, and in 1944, they cleared the Japanese from New Guinea and the Central Pacific, and they took the Philippines. These battles saw determined U.S. forces meet ferocious Japanese resistance. The casualties were staggering. Meanwhile, American troops pulverized Japanese cities with conventional bombs and the devastating firebombing of Tokyo, and in anticipation of an eventual invasion of the islands. But there was no American invasion of Japan. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. Japanese leaders remained defiant, however, and the Americans dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki 3 days later. Japan finally surrendered on August 14th. Now, turning to the domestic scene. On the issue of civil liberties at home, Japanese Americans received terrible treatment. After Pearl Harbor, government propaganda and popular culture portrayed the Japanese as a devious, malign, and savage people. The American government forced the Japanese to evacuate their homes within 48 hours to be interned in so-called relocation centers. Approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans living in the United States were interned. The director of the program stated that, quote, "The Japanese race is an enemy race, and while many second and third generation Japanese born on United States, possessed of United States citizenship, have become Americanized, the racial strains are undiluted. It therefore follows that along the vital Pacific coast, over 112,000 potential enemies of Japanese extraction are at large today." End of quote. In an interview, a Japanese American discussed how they feared the FBI. There was a lot of hysteria at the time, a lot of confusion, and the not knowing what was going to happen created such a fear that we became super cautious. We would hear that the FBI was going into different houses and searching, and we would wonder when they were coming to our house. We just knew that they were going to come and knock on the door, and we wouldn't know what to do when they came. It was a great shock when the FBI came and picked people up. They were loyal citizens who had followed all the rules and had respected authority. Suddenly, they were behind bars. After losing their land and belongings, they were sent to relocation centers in the Western mountains and desert. The Japanese Americans lost $500 million and their jobs. Another Japanese American recounted the confusion and distress he and his family experienced. Quote, "They had also built barbed wire fences around the camp with a tower on each corner with military personnel and machine guns, rifles, and searchlights. It was terrifying because we didn't know what was going to happen to us." End of quote. For 3 years, Japanese Americans lived in isolation under difficult conditions. Most Americans viewed those who had been born in the United States and who had never been to Japan as a threat to the security of America. In 2 major decisions, the Supreme Court of the United States supported the constitutionality of internment. For most Japanese Americans, the internment lasted until late 1944. News reports of Japanese cruelty and brutality of American prisoners of war made for bitter feelings towards anyone of Japanese ancestry. Although much less serious, another conflict with an identifiable group was over clothing. So I'm just going to look at actually a little interesting side history, popular culture during World War II. In the war years, young Mexican Americans wore Zoot Suits. These were adopted from the stylish fashion of Harlem hipsters. Such attire consisted of broad-shouldered, long-waisted suit coats with baggy white pleated pants pegged at the ankles. Zooters also wore greased ducktail haircuts. In Los Angeles, the city council made it a crime to wear a Zoot suit. Many Zooters dressed so as a form of rebellion. Zoot suits spread into working class whites who wanted to identify with the dress of the poor rather than the rich. The Zooters represented a subculture and they flaunted their alienation from the status quo. Mexican Americans found status in youthful society by wearing these Zoot suits. The Zoot suit attracted attention and offered freedom from the constraints of the older generation. Zooters were stereotyped as undesirable. In June 1943, Zoot suiters clashed with white American servicemen in Los Angeles. One sociologist suggested that many of the Mexican boys desired the patriotic status of the military uniform, and many of the sailors wanted the freedom symbolized by the Zoot suit. In the weeks leading up to the Zoot suit riots of 1943, sailors showed interest in Mexican American girls, and some servicemen were robbed and beaten up in Mexican neighborhoods. On June 3rd, a large group of sailors armed with rocks, sticks, clubs set out to assault Zooters. Various clashes took place over time. The Los Angeles Times reported that, quote, more than 50 Zoot suiters had clothing torn off as servicemen and civilians converged on bars, restaurants, penny arcades, and stores in downtown areas searching for Zoot suiters. Police were handicapped by the tremendous crowds of civilians who apparently had listened to the police riot calls on the radio and had rushed into downtown. They would disperse only after they unpanted the wearer of the comical clothing, end of quote. Newspaper reports were typically critical of any Zooter activity. For example, the Herald Express wrote on June 8th that, quote, "It was a sad day when Zoot Suiters began to molest some United States Navy men and some members of their families. They promised to rid the community of one of its newest evils, these zoot-suited miscreants who have committed many crimes and have added a very serious side to juvenile delinquency problems," end of quote. Now, the violence was more than a clash over Hispanic girls. There was a shortage of workers. Several 100,000 Mexicans came to America for jobs. In California, the arrival of thousands of African American and Hispanic workers per month resulted in tension. During the war, there were several important population shifts as millions moved to take jobs generated by the war industry. You had people leaving rural, going to the city. There was the rural interior to coastal cities. You have movement from east to west, south to north. Many thousands of Blacks left the Old South to work in the industrial cities of New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Detroit, leaving sharecropping and menial employment in restaurants, stores, and laundries. African Americans thought better working conditions and the higher pay offered in the industrial cities of the North and the West. In addition to the migration of Southern Blacks, displaced white coal miners and marginal farmers from the Appalachian region also moved to Detroit, Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati. African Americans and Southern whites competed for defense jobs and scarce housing. These population shifts led to permanent relocations for millions and helped set the emergence of a large middle class with better wages and an improved lifestyle. Before World War II, few Americans had ever filed an income tax form. In 1942 and after, those with an annual income of over $500 had to file income returns. There was more money than consumer products to be purchased. New cars and many other products were not being manufactured. There was little gasoline available to fuel automobiles. As a result of wartime labor shortages, over 6 million women joined the workforce. Rosie the Riveter stood for all the women who left home in World War II and went to work producing weapons. On the eve of Pearl Harbor, fewer than a third of all adult women worked for wages, and the rate was even lower for married women. With America's entrance into the war, women workers were needed to mount a fully effective industrial offensive. The factories paid well, $30 to $50 each week, but government officials did not believe that high wages would attract women from the kitchen and nursery where they held socially honored positions. Even with good wages, just how many women would leave the work and enter the grungy world of the factory to work 8 hours a day, 6 days a week? The government thought it was important to appeal to the patriotism of American women. There were many posters that clarified the noble task women could play in the war industry. There was Wendy the Welder, Miss Victory, and other posters without names proclaiming, "We can do it." These women were dressed in overalls, sleeves rolled up, showing their flexed muscles. In 1942, Rosie the Riveter was born and her image caught on. Anyone working in a war plant was a Rosie. Norman Rockwell's painting of Rosie the Riveter on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post became iconic. Quote, "This Rosie was a redhead, a bulging bicep and prodigious thighs, who sat saucily, her goggles and face visor thrown back, eating a sandwich, her massive rivet gun slung easily across her ample lap," end of quote. Women worked as well as men once they had the necessary training and experience. It was a two-women team who set the record for most rivets shot during a 10-hour shift. Rosie, however, was only to be temporary. The government expected most women to return to the home once the war was over. With so many working mothers employed, there was a rise in juvenile delinquency and teenage pregnancies. Still, not all women were willing to follow the government's preference for them to quit the workforce after the war. A survey in 1944, 1 year before the end of the war, found that 85% of women war workers wanted to remain in heavy industry after the war. Okay, conclusion, the lecture's conclusion. The United States maintained a policy of isolationism in the years leading to World War II. After Pearl Harbor, America quickly mobilized for war, and this pulled the nation out of the Great Depression. There were significant changes on the domestic front. On the dark side, Japanese Americans received horrible treatment. On the more positive side, women entered the industrial workforce unlike ever before. Overall, American men and women rose to the occasion and did their part to defeat Nazi totalitarianism and Japanese militarism.